Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Instagram Identity and Mass Psychology, the Da Vinci Code of Diversity. Something caused society to collectively continue reacting in the same frenetic way, as if it were acting out a pressing psychological need. Matthias Desmet, The Psychology of Totalitarianism. The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. Antonio Gramsci, Prison Notebooks. And this is the thumbnail, and as you can see, it's a superimposed image. So beneath you have the TV image and there were windows behind the tableau, so you could see the River Seine in Paris in the background. And above is the superimposition of Leonardo da Vinci's incredibly famous The Last Supper mural. And what I wanted to explore in this video is the obvious theme of the tableau at the bottom, that all the characters are various representations of diversity. And I wanted to look at the way in which diversity has become a prevalent ideology in our culture. And I'm not, as far as possible, trying not to make any judgments whatsoever on either side of debates over gender ideology and so on, but just to recognize the concept of ideology as a social-wide pervasive phenomenon. It exists everywhere. It's an inescapable part of the human condition, whether it's politics, people's views about gender and so on. But I just wanted to, I thought, because of the visual nature of this and the way in which this tableau at the Paris 2024 Olympics led to controversy, and it was perceived to be, I pointed out in the previous video where I looked at the Dionysian Papa Smurf character that isn't shown here, but I'll show in a second, how Dionysus was completely misused. It was basically the illiteracy of the artistic director of this ceremony that thought Dionysus could be used as a symbol of peace and brotherly love. And the reaction to this, it was deemed to be a pastiche of the Last Supper. There are various reasons to suggest that that was also just misguided and a misunderstanding of what was actually being depicted, although there are layers within layers, because as we'll see, the actual original painting this tableau was based upon was in turn influenced by the Last Supper, but it's a different painting that the tableau at the bottom is actually referring to. So there's layers of cultural references that have been misunderstood, and there are resonances that do exist, because and this is part of this channel's theme, the complexity of the resonances that exist within culture. And a theme of this particular video is the way in which those subtle nuances and resonances tend to get extirpated or driven out of our society because of this ever-increasing need to express ourselves ideologically and simplistically. So it's the whole video is basically a call for more nuance and for more understanding of cultural resonances. So having said that, this is another return to the great academic reference source known as Reddit. Well, and if I find stuff online that is, useful and interesting, I will use it, because I do give, I think, enough academic references. But this says La Seine, the Last Supper, La Seine, the stage, and La Seine, the river that goes through Paris, are all pronounced the exact same way in French. And this is it's not unique to French, but in the French language, I think the linguistic term is homonyms, phrases that sound or words that sound identical but have different meanings. And it's used by theorists such as French theorists like Jacques Lacan uses it to play with words. Derrida and people like this, they use these homonyms to actually show the arbitrary nature of meaning in some instances. So this was La Seine sous la Seine sous la Seine, the Last Supper on the stage on the Seine, which I think is a great example of the layers of resonance and meaning that are culturally specific to the French that would have been missed by some Anglophone viewers. So when people were getting upset that this was a parody or a pastiche of The Last Supper, this was at least one layer they were completely missing, the linguistic complexity. And this is what I looked at, the character in the foreground in the previous video, which, if you do enjoy this video, I'd encourage you to go back to if you haven't seen it, because they're standalone videos, but they do complement each other. Because in the previous video, I was concentrating on Papa Smurf Dionysus here. But for the rest of this video, I'd like to concentrate on the Last Supper element, and also just the wider implications. Dionysus is such a complicated Greek mythological figure. I wanted to talk about that last time. But in this video, I want to talk about the more general implications of what happens and how ideology is used in a society that increasingly doesn't know, or isn't familiar with, or isn't literate with some of the foundational cultural references that have created the societies we live in, but are increasingly being driven out by more simplistic modes of expression. And that relates to the whole notion of totalitarian society. A totalitarian society, for the purposes of this video, doesn't have to be an actual political totalitarian society as in the past fascist or countries or the Soviet Union. It's not necessarily that they are examples of totalitarian societies, but I'm talking about something different. I'm just identifying the total aspect of the phrase totalitarianism. And I'm alluding to the fact in our society, certain ideologies, diversity being the key one for the purposes of what I want to talk about, certain ideologies take off and become pervasive, ubiquitous, whatever word you'd like to use to describe how widespread and invasive they become in the body politic. And I just want to talk about why that might happen and what some of the implications are. So you can see in the background, various sexualities being represented, various gender identifications, and then you've got Miss Body Positive in the middle. And that seems to be, so this is on French TV, it was watched by a global audience, obviously the Olympic opening ceremony, but in the UK, and from what I've seen in North America too, there is this pervasive ideology that people's identity, their gender identifications need to be represented. And as far as the media goes, apparently out of all proportion to the percentage of the population that subscribe to any of these identities. So there's various issues, one of which is the way in which ideology spreads in a society in which mass media are powerful and important, and how disproportionality of certain ideologies may spread. So it's a complicated area, but just to look at the images, this was obviously, as I pointed out in the previous video, the Dionysian context, but the big controversy about to what extent in the background did this represent an affront to Christianity, to what extent was it a parody or a pastiche of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. It's interesting to note that I think his surname was Joly, the artistic director of the opening ceremony of the Olympics. I think he got his influence from the following painting, which was influenced, this is how complicated it gets, it was influenced by Da Vinci's Last Supper, but it's actually an independent painting that is to do with the Greek pagan gods and not Christianity. So the people who were affronted, they're partially right, because the painting I'm about to show you was influenced by Da Vinci's Last Supper, but they're also wrong because the director of the Paris opening ceremony, who maybe should have been a bit more aware of how his work might have been received, but he was actually trying to relate to the Greek myths, not Christianity. But this was the original painting. And you can see in the background in particular why it's quite obvious this was influenced by Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. And that's the original Last Supper from 1495 to 98. And it's the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. I think it's the refectory where the nuns ate, where you've got this stunning mural. And on another occasion, I'm going to do something on Renaissance painting and the development of perspective, and this is a particularly good example. You can see the vanishing, the horizon behind Christ's head, the sense of depth that's produced, three-dimensional depth on a two-dimensional plane. And of course, with reference to the subtitle of this video, you've got the whole Darren Brown, Da Vinci Code, the way it lends itself to conspiracy theories. And then you've got, I've said that people who were affronted and thought it was a slur against Christianity, that you could see why. And, that there's no definitive, it's not black and white. There were obvious connotations. And then it's a whole complex argument as to whether this parodies in any shape or form Christianity. But to show you this is the description from the Musée Magnier in Dijon. The gods have assembled on Mount Olympus for a banquet to celebrate the marriage of Thetis and Peleus. On the left are Minerva, Diana, Mars and Venus, accompanied by Cupid. Flora, the goddess of spring, stands behind them. Apollo, wearing his crown and identifiable by his lyre, presides at the centre of the table. Further away we can see Hercules with his club and Neptune with his trident. On the extreme right, Eris has placed the apple of disorder on the table. Certain gods are absent, hinted at by the presence of Juno's peacock, probably because the canvas was cut away on the left-hand side. So that's the descriptor at the actual museum in which this painting hangs. And one thing I just observed straight away is the level of complexity. And I've always said, I've done various videos about the labyrinthine nature of the Greek myths, but the way, like in Ovid's Metamorphoses, they feed upon each other like the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. Stories within stories. But that's one thing to think about, the relative one-dimensional nature of the tableau at the Paris opening ceremony and the original upon which it's based, and the complexity of the references in this compared to the tableau at the Paris Olympics, which I'd suggest was an ideological representation of diversity, of gender identification, body positivity, and various people that the ideology of diversity wants to promote. So, and I'm not making a judgment either way, I'm just saying the ideology that's being promoted is relatively one-dimensional compared to the richness of the references in this painting. And that goes to a central theme of this video, which is many of the references in our society, as was shown in the previous video that demonstrated how the mythical significance of Dionysus was completely misunderstood by the opening ceremony Paris Olympic organisers. They presented Dionysus as an emblem of brotherly love and peace, and he was the exact opposite. And likewise, allusions are made in our society using cultural resources like this from the ancient myths, but for, I would suggest, reductive purposes. This is a theme of the video in which, in our society, ideology simplifies and takes away nuance. And it's perhaps even a separate question to whether the ideology that's being promoted is good or bad. that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about how any ideology by its very nature simplifies. And that will lead on to a full discussion about the social implications on a wider social level. What happens when our society is more full of ideology than it is literary resonances and rich references if we've lost touch with those references? So if you can forgive me, because I love this quote. I did use it in the previous video, but I think it's good enough to bring it out again and bat you over the head with it. Etienne de la Boétie, The Discourse of Voluntary Servitude. And why I just think it's so special is it's almost 500 years old. And it describes, I think a commentator, a comment on the previous video pointed out, it almost describes our obsessive reliance upon smartphones, yet it was written 500 years ago. But the key thing I want to emphasize is the voluntary servitude. It's this paradoxical notion that Boétie was brilliant at addressing even that many hundreds of years ago. The idea that we tend to be fearful of dictators and people who are likely to oppress us directly, when what he wants to draw attention to is the way in which we can often connive at our own oppression. We can work on oppressing ourselves by our submissiveness or our inability to exert our independent subjectivity, to have our subjectivity given to us by social categories or the roles we fulfill. And I think he just expresses this beautifully. Do not imagine that there is any bird more easily caught by decoy, nor any fish sooner fixed on the hook by wormy bait, than are all these poor fools neatly tricked into servitude by the slightest feather passed, so to speak, before their mouths. Truly, it is a marvellous thing that they let themselves be caught so quickly at the slightest tickling of their fancy. Plays, farces, spectacles, gladiators, strange beasts, medals, pictures, and other such opiates. These were for ancient peoples the bait towards slavery, the price of their liberty, the instruments of tyranny. By these practices and enticements, the ancient dictators so successfully lulled their subjects under the yoke that the stupefied peoples, fascinated by the pastimes and vain pleasures flashed before their eyes, learned subservience as naively, but not so creditably, as little children learn to read by looking at bright picture books. So like I say, most of that quote, I think alludes directly to the degree to which in our modern society we're so dependent upon distracting images. And because those distracting images are entertaining, we connive at our own oppression by wanting more of them. But then I just found, since the last video, I've just been thinking about this quote more and more. And I want a little sub-theme of this video is this phrase at the very end, as little children learn to read by looking at bright picture books. And then it made me think of the phenomenon that I truly don't understand, but the drag queen story hour phenomenon. And why that's become an ideological battleground between left and right, or in the realm of gender identification. And I'm just going to leave the question hanging, but to take it back to, as little children learn to read by looking at bright picture books, I do find it interesting that the way in which children are to be taught about a particular viewpoint that until recently wasn't a widespread social thing is through the medium of stories. and to explore, why this might happen or what its significance is. The Critical Responses book here, this is the book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism. I'm going to take quite a few quotes from. So if you see Matthias Desmet's name at the bottom, it will be from this book. The one with the photograph of him, that's a collection of essays, and that I don't think that book comes out till August. So that's an advance image of the cover. And he's a clinical psychologist. I think he's I really apologise. I thought he was Belgian, but he's in the Belgium, Netherlands area. I think I remember reading in the book that he worked at the University of Ghent at one point and may still. But it's in that area, the Benelux countries. And the book came out, he used the majority of the examples, or one of the major focus of this book is he uses the very recent example of the pandemic and the way in which Western societies organise themselves in the face of the pandemic and the behaviour that governments engaged in and how the populations reacted. And the major source he in turn draws upon, Desmet, is Hannah Arendt was a important theorist around. She wrote the famous Eichmann in Jerusalem. That was the trial in Jerusalem of Adolf Eichmann, and she wrote a seminal work, The Origins of Totalitarianism, to explain what happened in Germany in the 30s and 40s. So he's using that as a template, but as a clinical psychologist, he's interested in the concept of mass formation and mass psychology. And it sounds emotive if you talk about totalitarianism, but I think one of his points is, and one of the points I want to bring out even more is, there are totalitarian aspects of modern society, irrespective of whether anyone's trying to be authoritarian, but just because of the communication mechanisms we use now that lend themselves to the formation of a class of people that you could call the mass populace. So in past historical times, you've always had the mass of the people. In ancient Rome, you had panem et circenses. Bread and circuses were used to placate what was routinely referred to as the Roman mob. So mob rule was something that the ruling authorities had to be careful of being beaten by. The mob had to be kept in check. We don't have the mob. We have a much more complex mass psychology that's mediated through the realm of communication technologies. And the psychology of totalitarianism looks at all these issues and more. It's thoroughly recommend it. So to give you some examples of how he approaches the topic, and this is my interpretation of his interpretation of Hannah Arendt and the concept of totalitarianism, and to repeat, his main focus is upon the pandemic. My main focus, he doesn't talk about gender ideology or diversity ideology in our society, but I do think there are similarities. And so I don't want him to be blamed for my interpretation. So I'll try and point out whenever I can how I think I'm taking liberties and giving my own personal opinion. But most of what follows are quotes from his book, just to try and make sure I'm being as fair as possible to his argument. So I'm suggesting, to repeat, Desmet doesn't talk much at all about, if at all, about diversity ideology or gender identification ideologies. So he's talking about how ideology and the formation of mass psychology occurs in general. So prior to mechanization, Man's world of experience constantly resonated with nature's ever-varying language of forms. After mechanization, he was mainly absorbed by a monotonous, mechanical rhythm. So I'm drawing upon this idea, which I'm going to develop further in a second. But my whole shtick in this video is that diversity, equity, and inclusion, the whole diversity agenda, whether it's good or bad, make your own mind up. But I'm trying to look behind what might be motivating what has exploded in recent years, the causal factors. And one causal factor is that it's a compensation, it's a reaction to a loss of meaning that Desmet describes here in terms of monotonous mechanical rhythm. So mechanization created a social reaction. People's lives were much less in tune. You know, societies used to be much more rural. And even if they were tough, at least you existed in a rural environment where you were closer to nature. With mechanization and the Industrial Revolution, that changed quite radically. And we've gone a step further. We've had a digital revolution. So I've italicized and emboldened language of forms, because this is the constant theme of the channel. Language, literature enables us to interpret things. And after mechanization, that language of forms has been replaced by, or mainly absorbed by, a monotonous mechanical rhythm. And in previous videos about Milan Kundera, I spoke about the unbearable lightness of being, which I'd suggest is even more applicable to not the monotonous mechanical rhythm, but the soundless digital evanescence of a world online. So social connections are also transformed beyond recognition. The invention of radio and television led to the rise of mass media and a corresponding decline in direct human interactions with a merely social function. They were progressively replaced by consumption of what the media presented. Social relationships lost their diversity and originality. Now, he was writing at the time just coming out of the pandemic. And this idea that there's and he's talking about social trends that existed since the Industrial Revolution. Direct human interactions with a merely social function are on the decline. So village life, village events, you know, people became more the anomie, it's called, of urban living. I think Irving Goffman, a sociologist, had a concept of the blasé attitude of living in a city. And you'll all experience it when you walk in a major city like New York or London. You don't look at people. Well, as far as you can avoid it, people don't make eye contact, people don't speak to each other. That's how you exist on the subway. Whereas in smaller communities, there are lots of human interactions with a merely social function, getting together for the sake of getting together. And coming out of the pandemic, the whole, I think why this is all fresh in Desmet's mind is people weren't allowed, even in a mechanized society, people's social gatherings were basically banned and prohibited. So there were less social gatherings anyway, because we live in this anomic society increasingly. But even they were closed down, so people led even more unbearably light digital lives. So those direct human interactions were progressively replaced by consumption of what the media presented. And then the next bit's interesting. Social relationships lost their diversity and originality. So why in the title I'm referring to compensatory ideology? The widespread emphasis in various media outlets and public forums on diversity, I'd suggest, is largely because genuine diversity in our society is being driven out more and more. So arguably, what I'm going to show you next is a response to these social trends. So I think this is an image from a RuPaul conference or event. So obviously drag queens and gender identification of various complex forms is much more prevalent than it ever has been historically. And I'm suggesting that this level of diverse appearance, it's interesting that it comes in apparent as an apparent corollary of a society in which diversity understood in a different way has decreased. So what previously Desmet referred to as direct human interactions. So we begin to consume what the media presents to us, and people take on the appearance and the mannerisms in quite an exaggerated form, as you can see here, of what's being shown on the media. And I'm asking the question, to what extent is this due to a loss of meaning and anxious acting out? So Desmet here is referring to traditional, quite oppressive political and religious structures throughout history. Although these structures curbed a man's freedom for centuries, or even radically suppressed it, they also offered him a psychological basis and frame of reference. They gave him rules and laws, commandments and prohibitions, boundaries to his lusts and urges, well-defined objects of anxiety, frustration, and anger. Their disappearance left man confused in the darkness of his own existence, haunted by existential anxiety and unease that could not be identified. This unfettered anxiety plays a crucial role in mass formation and totalitarianism. Now, just to re-emphasize this issue of totalitarianism, I'm not claiming that some contemporary ideologies about diversity and gender identification are in and of themselves totalitarian. What I'm suggesting is their prevalence and their the deep ideological nature of these new forms of social behavior and belief systems, that has certain qualities that are prevalent in totalitarian societies, and it's an important distinction, because Desmet and others are also just suggesting that totalitarianism, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition in the formation of mass psychology, that ideology becomes more and more prominent, and ideology plays an increasing role. The key thing here is that ideology takes many forms. There can be positive ideologies, evil ideologies. So I am not claiming various ideologies that have become dominant are necessarily evil or bad. What I am saying is they have certain ideological aspects that bear paying attention to. And why these ideologies have arisen, I'm suggesting there are interesting, Desmet's made me think more and more of this, the way in which ideologies tend to arise, as is pointed out here, when traditional forms of belief systems die out, and overarchingly, when the complexity of language and when traditional resources of literature, fairy tales, and all the things I talk about on this channel, when they're no longer as dominant or available as a resource, hence the misunderstanding of Dionysus by the Paris Olympic organisers, as I described in the previous video, ideology takes on interesting forms. And to say it takes on an interesting form, the next image should show the extent to which ideology can be linked to this notion of acting out. And again, I'm sure I'll be accused of this, I'm not being judgmental and I'm not being prudish, But I do think the next image shows a level of acting out that's interesting and unusual, insofar as there's an ideology, I would suggest, in society that's trying to make what I'm about to show you more acceptable and more normalized. So this is an image from, I think this is London Pride March. And one thing that just strikes me as vaguely interesting is that historically and in psychological terms, transgression, going against dominant values, part of the thrill of kinks and fetishes and being transgressive is that you're opposing mainstream society. But when kinks and fetishes like this become more and more mainstream, then where does the thrill of the kinky fetish go? Where do you derive the pleasure when you're knocking on an open door, so to speak? So that was a specific visual example, but then I want to go outwards and look at what's the overarching social atmosphere for some of the rise of these new ideological trends. And David Graeber wrote a book just called Bullshit Jobs. And it may sound slightly tangential. What have bullshit jobs got to do with the ideologies I'm talking about? But it goes to this concept of a generalized, pervasive sense of social anxiety. And Desmet emphasizes the extent to which, in a world where increasingly few jobs, to go back to this notion of direct human interactions, the relatively few jobs that still are premised upon direct human interaction, ironically, are ones that tend to be low paid. And this is one of the things that happened in the pandemic. People noticed all of a sudden how they relied upon relatively low paid people for basic human services. But most people live in a world in which they're controlled, or they are part of, very abstract jobs of which they never get to see the final product. To this notion of the unbearable lightness of bullshit jobs. To the way Desmet phrases it, today's compulsion to regulate and control is a frenetic attempt to master ever-growing anxiety. What makes work performance unbearable is usually not the actual demands, but the impossibility of experiencing meaning and satisfaction, of experiencing work as an act of creation. Does such a job free you from the burdens of life? Or does it make your life unbearably light? And the obvious references to the previous videos I've done on Milan Kundera's notion of the unbearable lightness of being. But I just think I hadn't thought this before, that it's an interesting, he's talking about the pervasive nature. More and more of our society is incredibly regimented and controlling, and it came out in the pandemic. I live in Wales, and there was a case where the Welsh government, and be careful what I say here, but at one point they roped off areas of supermarkets because they were obsessing about what could be determined as essential products and non-essential products, because they were interfering to that level with what shoppers could buy. And they roped off as non-essential products women's sanitary items. And I think Desmet talks, not using that specific example, but he gives examples about how roads in Belgium and the Netherlands are just absolutely immersed in white lines and cycle lanes and stopping points and parking bays, and you go into the countryside and you can finally find somewhere you can park your car anywhere, and it feels like a blessed relief. So this mania for control, and this is all part of a compensatory reaction to the fact that most people's work does not give them control. And this opens the question with gender ideology and various recent trends. To what extent is this fixation about identity due to the fact in many complex, subtle and historical ways, people have lost more and more control in their own lives, and they're trying to reassert it through finding more definite forms of identity. So this concept of digital lightness, again, I think it's a nice concept that Desmet comes out with. In digital interactions, our minds are tricked into believing that we are together, but our bodies know that we are not. What's so exhausting about digital conversations is being constantly in the presence of other people's absence. And yet again, this was an aspect of the pandemic. On the back of the pandemic and the aftermath, people using digital meetings all the time, online meetings, has become much more normal. I worked in the university sector where online teaching suddenly became, even after the pandemic was over, much more common for no apparent reason, which I thought was ludicrous, because a hugely important aspect of teaching is to have the personal contact, to be able to see the puzzled brow, the quizzical eyebrow, which means someone just hasn't understood what you've said and you need to go back over it. And from the student's point of view, hopefully they get to see the enthusiasm of a teacher, which in a subtle physical way has a massive effect on how you listen to what someone's saying. So then he says, if all this is true, then, so the first bit is a quote from Gian Piero Petriglieri. And then this is Desmet saying, if all this is true, then why are digital interactions so attractive? Because I think most people recognise digitality as a poor substitute, and yet we still spend so much time online or pursuing things that are digitally light. So the answer to that, in psychoanalysis, Desmet doesn't use this particular phrase, but it's an Italian phrase, che vuoi, and it means what you want. And I'm pretty sure Desmet was thinking about this when he wrote the following, because it basically encapsulates this che vuoi. But it's such a small phrase, but it's incredibly resonant, because I'll explain as I'm going along now, but at the heart of human communication through language, which is what separates us from animals, is the very thing that allows us to communicate with people, is the very thing that introduces ambiguity, complexity, and the fact you'll never fully know what somebody else wants from you. In the animal world, communication is more simple. Red will mean certain things, colours will mean things, the stance you take will mean something else. And they have limited communication ability, various animals. But in our language, ironically, in human language, incomprehensibility and ambiguity are central. Or to put it the way Desmet does, uncertainty is the preeminent characteristic of human experience. No other animal is so haunted by doubt or plagued by existential questions. And this is especially true of our relationship to the other. What does he want from me? And to give you a visual example of that, this is a previous video I did of Rear Window. And in that room, Jeff, the character on the other side of this courtyard, is looking for large parts of the film voyeuristically into this room. And he thinks he's seen Thorwald, the guy who's smoking that cigar. He suspects him of having murdered his wife. And then one night, you get the sense Thorwald is looking back. And Hitchcock was just such a brilliant, clever director, because in that cigar butt, that light, the embers, is almost a visual representation of the phrase, "Que voy?" What do you want? It's like, I just think it's such an evocative image on a prosaic brick wall, but you've got this like Eye of Sauron, this all from a cigarette. Sorry, a cigar, I think it is. With this glowing, demonic light in the darkness, which is symbolic of, the darkness of other people's minds, what we don't know. So this goes to the anxiety of language. In a digital conversation in which the other is literally kept at a distance but can still be reached, these eternal questions and the associated uncertainty and fear become less acute. The sense of control is far greater. It's easier to selectively show some things and hide others. In short, people feel psychologically safer and more comfortable behind a digital wall, but pay a price for it with the loss of connectedness and becoming an atomized subject, the essential component of the totalitarian state. So Desmet's pointing out, and Hannah Arendt points out in The Origins of Totalitarianism, one of the key features for having a compliant mass population that can be manipulated is for them to be atomized, for them to have lost strong bonds within their own society. And Rear Window, I'm trying to remember, 1954, I think it came out. And this is another, and that was of a time when America's obviously well industrialized by then, but you could argue cinema was in its prime, mass media, newspapers, big cities. This atomization is a major theme of the film Rear Window and quite a few of Hitchcock's other films. So this is an image from very early on, the opening scene of the film. And the character Lisa Fremont, who's played by Grace Kelly, this is a negative image of a photograph of her. I'm pretty sure it's her. If it's not her, it's in the flat of Jeff, her boyfriend. And the irony is, Lisa is a model. In real life, Grace Kelly, one of the most famous actresses in the world, if not the most famous. She became a princess. She married the Prince of Monaco. But in this image, she's reduced to a negative. It's Hitchcock pointing out she models clothes, and the whole theme of the film is that she leads quite a vacuous, materialistic life. And this is an early representation of that. Which, given this is 1954 film, I hope you could see the relevance of this to the discussion about digital lightness. People become ciphers, people become negatives, evanescent, flickering figures of real people. So this is, Hitchcock 1954 film. This is an Edward Hopper painting that I also think represents brilliantly this idea of atomization. So you can see the figure, one single figure, framed by the window of an anonymous building, apartment block. And this, I'm trying to remember, from Williamsburg Bridge, I think this was. And I'm guessing late 1920s, 28, I think. So, only a couple of decades difference between this painting. And I know for a fact, in a previous video, I think I've pointed out that the house in Psycho, there was an Edward Hopper painting that that I think Hitchcock modelled the house in Psycho on. So Hitchcock was definitely aware of Hopper's work. And I always just think of this painting as, I always think of it alongside Rear Window. So then to talk about the concept of the rise of identity ideology, and I don't even mean infantile in a pejorative way, I'm actually describing it in a psychological schema. The way in which human psychology, identity is developed over the lifetime of a human being. Which I'll explain, I'll go through the process, but Desmet talks about it in terms of narcissism. In excessive narcissism, the mental visual boundary between the subject and the other becomes so thick and pronounced that the subject becomes mentally locked up in this self-image. The visual self-image then attracts the mental energy and attention to such an extent that the image of the other no longer lights up in the mental experience. So there's this concept of being trapped in images of ourselves and each other, but increasingly ourselves. The whole way in which online life and online influencers are constantly looking at mirrors of themselves. And this idea that in excessive narcissism is basically an undeveloped psychological state. Excessive narcissism comes at the expense of empathy, to the extent that it diminishes a person's ability to resonate with others and with the world. It renders that person lonely and isolated. So this photograph's obviously been taken for artistic effect, but I think it's not a bad representation of this atomization of the individual. This is where I do my bad Slavoj Žižek impression. I want a third pill. The idea of red pill, blue pill, and is there a third pill for psychological health? Excuse me. So the first stage, why I referred to narcissism as an infantile or infantile identity ideology, it's in, I think it's around about 6 to 8 months, Lacan talks about the way in which a baby will recognize for the first time its image in a mirror. And it's a crucial psychological formative experience, because for the first time the baby recognizes itself as an entity in the world, a self-enclosed entity. It's not just linked to its mother. Before it recognizes itself in a mirror, the theory is a baby just sees itself as this umbilical link to it. Although it's had its umbilical cord cut, it's still linked intrinsically to its mother, who feeds it all the time and has it close to her all the time. And the mirror stage is the beginning of recognizing that you're an individual in the world, and that in a way is great because you get to develop as an individual, but also it's lonely and isolating because you begin to be separate from the rest of the world. So that's the mirror stage. And then the child, as it grows, the idea of nascent rationality. So it's when kids start asking parents or other adults, why is something, why? And eventually the adult can only say, just because it is. And the child increasingly realizes by going through this ad nauseum process that adults don't have all the answers. It's the child learning slowly but surely that these powerful authority figures actually don't know everything. So that's when rationality, the child, first of all, has identified itself in the mirror. Then it tries rationality to sort out its place in the world. And then thirdly, if the child finds in stories and fairy tales a way of psychologically dealing with A, the anxiety of the mirror stage when it finds it's on its own in the world, B, when it finds that there aren't rational answers to everything. So the third pill is this world of stories and fiction. And it may sound a huge stretch, but there's strong arguments from St. Thomas Aquinas. Sorry, not Thomas Aquinas. St. Augustine wrote the Confessions very early on in the church's history. And it's, as the name would imply, it's got a confessional tone. Works like La Recherche de Pompidou, Proust, the way in which it's written from a first-person subject, a profound book written from the first-person perspective over decades, the way it's presented in the novel. All of these ways, its literature is profoundly linked to how our subjectivity develops. So the creation of individuality through the transition from a logical rational to an evocative creative use of language is a third possible response to the uncertainty of the human condition. That does not equal a fall into irrationality. This creative act, in contrast to narcissism and regulation mania, is indeed a real solution to the uncertainty inherent in human relationships and human existence in general. It connects man with the other and leads to resonance with love objects instead of psychological isolation and self-destructiveness. At the same time, it also creatively realizes individuality and psychological sovereignty. So what I like about this quote is the way he links narcissism and regulation mania. And I also see regulation mania, the way more and more aspects of our lives are controlled, or, even if not controlled, the mania to tell us what we should be eating, what we should be drinking. Fitbit watches that tell you how you've slept, how many steps you're taking. This invasive, mania for structuring more and more aspects of our lives. And it doesn't strike me as a huge stretch to say, is it that surprising there's a mania of identity? There's a mania to label every little subset of how people identify themselves. And all of this has coincided with the absolute decline of the very evocative, creative use of language, literature, poetry. All of these things are on the decline. And Desmet is suggesting, in keeping with everything I've been saying on this channel, that this is a massively important resource for creatively realizing individuality and psychological sovereignty. So the corollary of this argument is, when you lose literature, when you lose great art, and you're reduced to regulation mania and narcissism, guess what? You lose psychological sovereignty. You feel atomized. You feel lonely. You lash out. And I won't spend a lot of time on this because in future I'm going to return to it. But if you want to know how, when complex literacy, when high-level literature is lost, this is the language that replaces it. This is the language of advertising. And Roland Barthes, in a brilliant essay, The Rhetoric of the Image, he just analyzes it brilliantly. And like I say, I will do this in future. But one thing to take from this is, if you pay attention to what's going on in that advert, the identity that's being promoted is Italian food as fresh as the real thing? So the basket overflowing like fish falling out, just fresh from the market. But the only things that can be bought as a commodity there, it's Parmesan cheese that's been grated for you. It's a tin of salsa, and it's dry pasta. So these are completely non-fresh products being sold in the complete opposite guise as the ultimate in freshness. And I'm just showing you this to give you an example of the way in which, at a low, small level, advertising is premised upon selling you the opposite of what it really is. And then when people, in a totalitarian society, people sometimes think that they tend to lean towards conspiracy theories. They tend to think that there have to be very powerful people in charge pulling all the strings. And one aspect of Desmond's book is that totalitarian, ideologically driven societies, actually, small things like this, if they're replicated across a society, if everyone buys into this type of ideology that's based upon a false premise, then the overall effect can be profound, pervasive, invasive, ubiquitous, all these words to describe just how prevalent it is. And the technical thing is this is a self-similar fractal shape that just repeats endlessly. And the point I'm trying to make is that it only takes people across a society to do a small thing. And what you get is this totalitarian parallel, this self-similar fractal outcome, which is known as the Sierpinski Triangle. And I'll start summing up, but crucially, and this is something I'm going to return to in future, a major distinction is to be found between signs and symbols. Literature and art are a mythology are absolutely dependent upon rich symbols. So remember the painting I showed at the very beginning of this talk, the Feast of the Gods, and the description from the museum in Dijon. The complexity of those symbols, how each one related to the other, and then each one of those gods related to a phenomenon in the world or a human instinct. Whereas signs are the opposite. Signs reduce meaning. Signs are much more similar to that image, the fake image, to sound like Donald Trump, the fake image of the Italian food that isn't fresh, that you're buying as a commodity, selling itself under the guise of freshness. It's the difference between signs and symbols. So the frenetic urge of totalitarianism to impose a basic logic on society also manifests itself in the obsession with signs. With its sign system, totalitarianism tries to imprint its logic on reality, to permanently link it to the real world. Importantly, the assignment of signs and stigmas is usually the first step in the process of destruction. At this point, we're able to pinpoint the psychological essence of totalitarianism, an attempt to produce the polysemy of human language to the monosemy of a sign system. Certain words always trip me up. Polysemy as in multi-meaning, as in I give up. The monosemy of a sign system. So it's the symbol is polysemic. It's got depth and breadth. The monosemic is the sign. And what all this leads to is this is a phrase I'm using, not Desmet, but dynamic linguistic absurdity, which I think describes what now Desmet talks about. Human language creates a fundamental uncertainty, which constitutes man's greatest anguish. No other living being is tormented by questions such as, who am I? What do I want? What do I mean to the other? Totalitarianism is the ultimate attempt to rid ourselves of this uncertainty by trying to reduce symbols to signs and by trying to annihilate all variety in cultural expression. Totalitarianism obliterates such diversity in every possible way. The logic is in constant flux and typically becomes ever more absurd. The raison d'etre of a totalitarian system consists of channeling anxiety, which is why it must constantly identify new objects of anxiety. So this goes back to the regulation mania. So people's jobs are full and general lives now are full of these intrusive regulations. But another side of it is this trying to reduce symbols to signs and trying to annihilate all variety in cultural expression. So the irony is, with current diversity ideology, like the Italian food being sold under the guise of being fresh when it's pre-packaged and tinned, diversity ideology sells itself as being diverse when, as is pointed out here, it's doing the exact opposite. It's reducing the diversity of definitions. It's reducing the diversity of language by trying to regulate identity into fixed categories. And more, identity becomes an object of anxiety. And this explains the ever more complicated symbols. Well, signs, I'd say. To me, this is a sign, not a symbol, because it's the agglomeration of ever more specific forms of identity that they're trying to capture in a symbolic form, but it just becomes swamped by the sign quality of trying to depict ever more specific details. Symbols don't work like that. Symbols work through ambiguity and resonance, whereas this is trying to be ever more specific. So this was an image I used in a previous video about, this is the Two-Spirit Pride flag. Ever more identity comes under the sign of diversity. And then I'll just finish with this. It's not a brilliant, it's a very specific of its time poem, but the Dunciad by Alexander Pope. But I just love one of the final stanzas. I think it sums up what's going on in a beautifully poetic way. Ironically, given that poetry isn't given much time these days. Lo, thy dread empire, chaos is restored. Light dies before thy uncreating word. Thy hand, great anarch, lets the curtain fall, and universal darkness buries all. I think that's a brilliant description of the endlessly complicated terminology that everyone's subjected to now. Thy uncreating word. And universal darkness buries all. So, lo, thy dread empire should be most people's response to their HR department. And then to return, I'll just finish with this quote and then one final image. But again, this notion of voluntary servitude. One aspect of the new totalitarianism we all live under, it wouldn't even be so bad, even though people try and demonize political leaders. They are not really the problem. We do it to ourselves. Like the Sierpinski Triangle at a much lower level. So again, I just think it's stunning. This was written in 1576. Where has he acquired enough eyes to spy upon you if you do not provide them yourselves? How can he have so many arms to beat you with if he does not borrow them from you? How does he have any power over you except through you? How would he dare assail you if he had no cooperation from you? What could he do to you if you yourselves did not connive with the thief who plunders you? I just absolutely love that. Conniving with the thief who plunders you. So it's just an open question to you and me. To what extent do we let this do we let this mania for regulation and totalitarian ideological pervasiveness, to what extent do we put ourselves through it and do it to ourselves? So having said all that, I hope you enjoyed it. And until the next time, but I'll finish with this one image that also demonstrates the difficulty. So that was basically a mini rallying call for we should all get off our backsides and do something about it. And then, because I don't believe in too much optimism, just to give you a little illustration of how pervasive this totalitarian semiotic system we all exist under is. This is a shop on the coast of Tanzania, on a little island called Mafia Island, appropriately enough. So the ideology of all about the base has reached even to the absolute outskirts of the coast of Africa. So until the next time, all the very best. Take care.